Lonely rancher bought a girl at auction. Not knowing she was the sheriff's secret daughter, a lonely rancher spent his last $50 on a terrified girl at auction, not knowing she was the sheriff's secret daughter. What happened next broke two men's hearts and changed three lives forever. This is a story about the price we pay for love, the weight of abandoned promises, and how sometimes the family we choose becomes stronger than the blood we're born with. In the dusty town of Clearwater, where silence holds more secrets than words. The morning sun burned low over Clearwater, painting the town square the color of old blood. Thomas Wade stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled down against the light, watching the auctioneer's hammer fall again and again. Each strike drove another nail into someone's coffin of debt. He had come to town for supplies, salt, coffee, maybe a new bridle if the price was right. He had not come to watch lives get sold like cattle. But here he stood, boots planted in dust that had seen too many tears, listening to the auctioneer's voice cut through the desert air like a rusty saw. The man's words rolled over the crowd, smooth as snake oil, turning human suffering into dollars and cents. Thomas had heard this song before. It was the same tune that played when his own ranch nearly went under, when the bank men came with their papers and their cold eyes. The crowd pressed closer to the wooden platform that sat in the middle of the square like a stage for tragedy. Men in worn suits counted coins in their pockets. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their faces a mix of pity and hunger. Children peeked between adult legs, not understanding why the grown-ups looked so serious, why the air tasted like salt and sorrow. Thomas shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His horse, Buck, waited tied to the hitching post outside Murphy's store, probably wondering why they had stopped here instead of heading straight back to the ranch. Thomas wondered the same thing. He had business to tend to, cattle to feed, fences to mend. A man alone had no time to stand around watching other people's troubles unfold. Then she stepped onto the platform. The girl could not have been more than 12 years old, maybe 13 if the desert had aged her young. Her dress was clean but patched, the kind of careful mending that spoke of a mother's love even in the face of poverty. Her hair hung in two braids down her back, the color of wheat before harvest. But it was her eyes that stopped Thomas cold, green as spring grass, wide with fear that went deeper than the moment. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything and was about to lose what little remained. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Next we have Sarah Collins, age 12. Healthy, can cook and clean, good with animals. Starting bid is $20. Sarah. The name hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His own daughter had been named Sarah. Little Sarah Wade, who used to sit on his knee and ask him to tell stories about the stars. Who caught fireflies in mason jars and cried when they died. Who burned with fever for 3 days before slipping away like smoke in his arms. This Sarah, this stranger with his daughter's name, stood with her chin up despite the tears that ran silent down her cheeks. She did not beg. She did not plead. She just stood there and let herself be looked over like a horse at market, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. $20, called out a voice from the crowd. Thomas turned to see Jake Morrison, the town's blacksmith, raising his hand. Jake was a good man, but his wife had died in childbirth 2 years back, and he had been drinking more than working lately. The thought of this child, this Sarah, in that dark house filled with empty bottles made Thomas's jaw tighten. 25, came another voice. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house with an iron fist and a sharp tongue. She worked her girls hard and paid them little. Thomas had seen the hollow look in their eyes, the way they moved like ghosts through the town streets. The bidding continued. Each number was another nail, another chain, another year of servitude for a child who should have been playing with dolls instead of standing on an auction block. Thomas found himself studying her face, looking for signs of his own Sarah in the curve of her cheek, the set of her shoulders. It was foolish, he knew. The dead stayed dead, no matter how much a man wished otherwise. $35, called Mrs. Henderson, her voice sharp with certainty. She was used to winning these auctions, used to adding new girls to her collection of workers. Going once, said the auctioneer, his hammer raised. Going twice. Thomas looked at the girl again. Sarah. She was looking right at him now, those green eyes meeting his across the crowd. In them, he saw something that made his chest tight. Not hope. Hope was a luxury she could not afford, but a kind of quiet courage, the same courage his own Sarah had shown when the fever took hold. The courage of someone who had learned too young that the world was hard, and help did not come to those who waited for it. His hand went to his shirt pocket, where the money for winter supplies waited in a worn leather pouch. $68. Enough for salt and coffee and grain to see him through the cold months. Money that meant the difference between comfort and hunger when the snow piled high around his cabin. The hammer began to fall. $50. The words left Thomas's mouth before he could stop them, loud enough to cut through the murmur of the crowd. Heads turned in his direction. The auctioneer paused, hammer still raised. Mrs. Henderson's face went red with anger. And the girl, Sarah, looked at him with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the first hint of hope she had felt in a long time. $50 from Thomas Wade. The auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the square. Do I hear 55? The crowd had gone quiet. Everyone knew Thomas Wade. The man who lived alone on the ridge, who came to town only when he needed supplies, who spoke to no one unless spoken to first. The man who had buried his wife and daughter in the same month and never quite found his way back to the land of the living. Mrs. Henderson opened her mouth, then closed it again. $50 was more than she wanted to pay for one girl, no matter how useful. Jake Morrison was already walking away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The other bidders melted back into the crowd like smoke. $50 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. He looked around the crowd one last time, waiting for someone else to speak up to save him from selling to the strange hermit on the ridge. When no one did, he brought the hammer down with a sound like thunder. Sold to Thomas Wade for $50. The crowd began to break up, moving on to the next item, the next tragedy. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, unsure what came next. He had bought supplies before, horses, cattle, but never a child, never a girl with green eyes who looked at him like he might be the answer to a prayer she had been too afraid to say out loud. He walked to the platform where Sarah still stood, her small hands no longer clenched into fists. Up close, he could see the freckles across her nose, the way her lower lip trembled just slightly. She was smaller than she had looked from a distance, fragile as a bird with a broken wing. "What's your name?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Collins." Thomas nodded. He reached into his pocket and counted out $50 in bills and coins, handing them to the auctioneer without looking at the man's face. The money felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the knowledge that he had just bought a person, no matter what the law called it, that he had become the kind of man he had always despised. But when he looked at Sarah, at her eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young, he found he could not regret it. Not yet, anyway. "Come on, then," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Let's get you home." Sarah climbed down from the platform on unsteady legs, her shoes making soft sounds against the wood. She followed him through the crowd, past the whispers and stares, past the people who had watched her get sold like livestock and done nothing to stop it. Thomas could feel her behind him, a small shadow that made him remember what it felt like to be responsible for someone other than himself. At the hitching post, Buck snorted and stamped his feet, eager to be away from the noise and dust of town. Thomas untied the reins and looked down at Sarah, who stood beside the big horse with something like wonder in her eyes. "You ever ridden a horse?" he asked. She shook her head. "Well," Thomas said, "today's as good a day as any to learn." He helped her up onto Buck's broad back, his hands careful and sure. She was lighter than he had expected, all bones and determination. When she was settled, he swung up behind her and gathered the reins. "Hold on," he said, as they rode out of Clearwater, the town falling away behind them like a bad dream. Thomas found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. He was not a father anymore, had not been for 3 years. did not know how to talk to children, how to comfort them when they cried, how to keep them safe from the things that lurked in the darkness of the world. But maybe, he thought as Sarah leaned back against his chest, maybe it was enough to simply try. The road stretched out before them, leading toward the mountains and home, toward whatever came next in this strange new life they would build together. The first morning came too soon, painted gray with mountain mist and the kind of quiet that lives in lonely places. Thomas woke to find Sarah already awake, sitting by the cabin door with her knees pulled to her chest. She had not moved from that spot all night, he realized. Had not trusted sleep, had not trusted the walls around her to keep her safe. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep and careful gentleness. She turned her head toward him, but said nothing. Her green eyes were wide and watchful, like a deer that had caught the scent of wolves on the wind. In the gray light, she looked even smaller than she had on the auction block, a child-shaped shadow against the wooden door. Thomas sat up slowly, making no sudden movements. He had gentled wild horses before, creatures that had known too much of the whip and not enough of kindness. The trick was patience. The trick was letting them come to you instead of reaching out with grabbing hands. "You hungry?" he asked. A nod. Small, barely there, but still a nod. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, the familiar morning rituals helping to fill the silence that stretched between them. Sarah watched his every move from her place by the door, her body coiled tight, like she might bolt at any moment. When he pulled out a pan to fry eggs, she flinched at the sound of metal against metal. "Sorry," Thomas said quietly. "I'll try to be quieter." She blinked at that, surprise flickering across her face like she had never heard a grown man apologize for anything before. Maybe she hadn't. Breakfast was beans and eggs and coffee that was too strong for a child, but which Sarah drank without complaint. They ate in silence, the only sounds a scrape of forks against tin plates and the pop of wood burning in the stove. Thomas found himself stealing glances at her, trying to read the thoughts that moved behind her eyes like shadows across water. When they finished eating, he showed her around the small cabin. This was where she could sleep, he said, pointing to the bed in the corner. This was where they kept the lamp oil, the extra blankets, the tin of salve for cuts and scrapes. She followed him like a ghost, saying nothing, touching nothing, as if afraid that reaching out might make it all disappear. The days that followed fell into a pattern as slow and steady as breathing. Thomas would wake to find Sarah already up, always by the door, always watching. He would make coffee and breakfast while she sat silent as stone. Then they would go outside, and he would teach her the small lessons of staying alive. How to milk the cow without getting kicked. How to scatter grain for the chickens and gather their eggs. How to tell if the well water was running clean. How to read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks that did not belong. Sarah learned fast, her small hands quick and sure once she understood what was needed. But she never spoke unless spoken to, never asked questions, never complained when the work was hard or the day was long. She moved through the world like she was trying not to leave footprints, trying not to take up any space that someone might want back. At night, she would help him cook supper, beans and cornbread mostly, sometimes a rabbit if Thomas had been lucky with his snares. She would wash the dishes in silence while he sat by the fire, and try not to think about how empty the cabin had been before she came, how the silence had been heavier somehow, like the weight of his own loneliness pressing down on his chest. But Sarah's silence was different. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of holding too much inside. Sometimes he caught her staring at nothing, her eyes far away and full of shadows. Sometimes she would start at sounds that were not there, her head turning toward doors and windows like she expected something terrible to come walking through. She slept on the floor by the door despite the bed he had offered her. Every morning he found her there, curled up on a thin blanket with one hand always touching the wooden threshold, ready to run. Always ready to run. 3 weeks passed this way before they had to go back to town for supplies. Thomas had been putting it off, making do with what they had, but the coffee was running low and winter was coming whether they were ready or not. He needed salt for the meat, flour for bread, lamp oil for the long, dark nights ahead. "We need to go to town," he told Sarah over breakfast, watching her face carefully. She went still, her fork halfway to her. For a moment, he thought she might refuse, might finally speak up and tell him she would rather stay hidden in the cabin forever. But she just nodded and set down her fork, her breakfast suddenly forgotten. The ride to Clearwater was quiet, Sarah sitting in front of him on Buck's broad back, her body tense as wire. As they got closer to town, Thomas felt her begin to shake, small tremors that ran through her like she was cold despite the warm afternoon sun. "You all right?" he asked, though he could see she was not. "Yes, sir," she whispered, the first word she had spoken in days. They tied Buck outside Murphy's store and went inside, Sarah staying close to Thomas's side like a shadow that had learned to walk. Mrs. Murphy smiled and made small talk while she gathered their supplies, but her eyes kept drifting to Sarah with the kind of curiosity that felt like prying. "How's the girl working out?" she asked as she wrapped their flour in brown paper. "Fine," Thomas said, his voice flat. "She's fine." They were loading their supplies into Buck's saddlebags when Sheriff Morrison appeared, his boots making sharp sounds against the wooden sidewalk. Thomas had known Morrison for years, had always thought him a decent man, trying to do a hard job. But something in the way the sheriff looked at Sarah made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. "Thomas," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good to see you in town." "Sheriff." Morrison's eyes shifted to Sarah, who had gone completely still beside Thomas. "And this must be the girl you bought at auction." "Sarah, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, but did not look up, her eyes fixed on the ground at her feet. "Pretty little thing," Morrison said, and there was something in his voice that made Thomas's jaw tighten. "Reminds me of someone, but I can't quite place who." "We should be getting back," Thomas said, his hand moving to rest lightly on Sarah's shoulder. She was shaking again, harder now, like she might fly apart if he let go. Of course," Morrison said, but he did not step aside. "Just curious about the girl's background, you understand. Like to keep track of who's living in my territory." "Her background is her own business," Thomas said quietly. Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "Everything in this county is my business, Thomas. You know that." The two men stood facing each other in the afternoon sun, and Thomas could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air between them. Morrison's hand rested casually on his gun belt, not quite a threat, but close enough to feel like one. Finally, Morrison stepped aside. "You folks have a good day now," he said, tipping his hat again. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other real soon." They rode out of town in silence, Sarah's body pressed back against Thomas's chest like she was trying to disappear into him. Only when Clearwater was far behind them did she stop shaking, her breathing slowly returning to normal. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas found himself watching Sarah's face in the flickering light. She was staring into the flames with an expression he had seen before in the eyes of animals that had been hunted too long. "Sarah," he said gently. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had brought her home, he saw something other than fear in her eyes, something that looked almost like trust. "Yes, sir. If there's anything you need to tell me," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Anything at all, you can. You're safe here." She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice so small he almost missed it, she said, "I know who he is." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "Who?" "The sheriff," she whispered, her green eyes reflecting the firelight like broken glass. "I know who he is, and he knows who I am." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkness, but Thomas could not take his eyes off Sarah's face, off the terrible knowledge that lived there. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and doors, as if something dark and hungry was testing the walls that kept them safe, looking for a way in. The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah sat curled in her chair, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames that danced and whispered in the stone hearth. Thomas waited, letting the silence stretch until she was ready to break it with the truth that had been eating at her like poison. "My mama's name was Elizabeth Collins," Sarah finally said, her voice so quiet Thomas had to lean forward to hear her. "She was beautiful, Hair like corn silk, eyes blue as summer sky. That's what people used to tell me. Thomas nodded, saying nothing. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant weeping. She worked at the hotel in town, cleaning rooms and serving food. She was 19 when she met him. Sarah's fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress, small hands working at the worn cotton like she was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. He was new then. Sheriff Morrison, young and handsome and full of big ideas about cleaning up the territory. The fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Thomas could see where this story was heading, could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest like a stone. He used to come to the hotel after his rounds, tired and dusty from chasing outlaws and settling disputes. Mama would bring him coffee and pie, and they would talk about books and music and all the places they wanted to see someday. Sarah's voice grew softer, more distant, like she was telling a story someone else had told her long ago. He said he loved her, said they would get married as soon as he saved up enough money to build a proper house. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. He had known men like Morrison before, men who made promises as easy as breathing and broke them just as quick when something better came along. What happened? He asked, though he already knew. The governor offered him a job in the capital. Better pay, better prospects, a chance to make something of himself. Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. He said it was just for a year, maybe 2. Said he would send for her once he got settled. But he never did. Sarah shook her head. Mama waited. Kept working at the hotel, kept saving every penny, kept telling herself he would come back for her. But months turned into a year, and a year turned into 2, and still no word. Then she found out she was carrying his child. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of old pain, old betrayals that had echoed down through the years to land here, in this small cabin where a man and a girl sat by firelight and shared the truth of their scars. She never told him about you, Thomas said. It was not a question. She was proud, Sarah said simply. Said she would rather raise his child alone than beg for scraps from a man who had already forgotten her name. So she did. Worked double shifts at the hotel, took in washing and mending. We were poor, but we were happy. At least I thought we were. Thomas could picture it. A young woman working herself to the bone to provide for her daughter, carrying the secret of the child's father like a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. The kind of burden that wore a person down from the inside out. She got sick last winter, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper now. Cough that wouldn't go away, fever that came and went like the tide. Doctor said it was her lungs, said all those years of working in the hotel kitchen, breathing in smoke and steam, had finally caught up with her. The fire popped and hissed, and both of them jumped slightly at the sound. Sarah pulled her knees closer to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Before she died, she told me the truth. About who my father was, about why she never married, about why we lived the way we did. She made me promise never to tell him, never to ask him for anything. Said some men were not meant to be fathers, even if their blood ran in your veins. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, a familiar ache that had nothing to do with his own losses and everything to do with the broken child sitting across from him. But he found out anyway. Sarah nodded. Someone must have told him after the funeral. Maybe Mrs. Murphy or one of the other women who knew Mama. Maybe he figured it out himself. I have his eyes, people always said. Green like spring grass, just like his. Is that why you were at the auction? Because of the debts. Mama borrowed money from the bank to pay for medicine, for doctors who couldn't help her anyway. When she died, they wanted it back. Said I could work off what we owed, or they would send me to the orphanage in Denver. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. I chose to work. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of what she had been through, what she was still going through. A 12-year-old girl, orphaned and alone, forced to choose between servitude and abandonment. And now her father, a man who had never acknowledged her existence, wanted to claim her like she was property he had misplaced. He came to see you, Thomas said. Morrison, after your mother died. Sarah's whole body went rigid. Once. Right before the auction, came to the boarding house where I was staying, asked Mrs. Henderson if he could speak to me privately. What did he say? Nothing at first. Just looked at me for the longest time like he was seeing a ghost. Then he asked if I was Elizabeth Collins' girl, and I said yes. Asked if she had ever mentioned him, and I lied. Said no. Thomas could picture the scene. Morrison standing in some dingy room, staring at the child he had never wanted, trying to figure out what to do with the inconvenient reminder of his past. Sarah, small and afraid, protecting her mother's memory with a lie. He knew I was lying, Sarah continued. I could see it in his eyes. But he didn't push it, just said he was sorry for my loss and walked away. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. No, he started watching me after that. I would see him across the street when I walked to the market, or standing in doorways when I helped Mrs. Henderson with her errands. Like he was trying to work up the courage to talk to me again, or try to decide what to do about me. Thomas stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond. The night was still and cold, but something in his gut told him it would not stay that way for long. Men like Morrison did not let things lie when they felt their conscience pricking at them. He wants you back, Thomas said quietly. Yes. Sarah's voice was small and scared. Not because he loves me. Not because he wants to be a father. But because he knows what people will think if they find out he abandoned his own child. Let her get sold at auction like livestock. Thomas turned back to face her, and in the firelight she looked even younger than her 12 years. A child who had been forced to grow up too fast, to understand too much about the ways adults could fail each other and the children who paid the price for their failures. He can't have you, Thomas said, and the words came out harder than he had intended. Sarah looked up at him with those green eyes that were too old for her face. He's the sheriff. He can do whatever he wants. Not while I'm breathing. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before. This one was charged with something dangerous, something that tasted like gunpowder and blood. Thomas could feel it building in his chest. The same cold fury that had kept him alive through range wars and cattle disputes, through the long years when the only law was the gun on your hip and the will to use it. They both heard the sound at the same time, hoofbeats on the hard ground outside, coming up the path that led to the cabin. Thomas moved to the gun belt hanging on its peg by the door, his hand closing around the familiar weight of his Colt. Sarah scrambled to the window, pressing her face against the glass. It's him, she whispered, her breath fogging the pain. He's alone. Thomas checked the cylinder of his gun, making sure each chamber held a bullet. 6 shots. It would have to be enough. Sarah, he said quietly, go to the back room and stay there. Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. He'll kill you. Maybe. But I won't make it easy for him. The hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin, and Thomas could hear the creak of saddle leather as Morrison dismounted. Boots on the wooden steps. A knock on the door, polite as Sunday church. Thomas, came Morrison's voice through the wood. I think it's time we had talk. Thomas looked at Sarah one last time, memorizing her face in case this was the last chance he got. Then he squared his shoulders, pulled back the bolt on the door, and stepped out into the night to meet whatever was coming. The two men stood facing each other in the moonlight, and Thomas could see the weight of guilt and desperation in Morrison's eyes, the look of a man who had run out of choices and was prepared to do whatever it took to quiet the voices in his head. The mountain air held the kind of stillness that comes before storms or after them, when the world holds its breath and waits to see what will be born from the wreckage. Thomas stepped down from the cabin porch, his boots making soft sounds on the hard-packed earth, his hand resting easy on the grip of his Colt. The weight of the gun felt familiar as his own heartbeat, but tonight it felt heavier somehow, loaded with more than just lead and powder. Sheriff Morrison stood 20 feet away, his own hand hovering near his weapon but not quite touching it. In the pale moonlight, he looked older than Thomas remembered, his face carved deep with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and choices that could not be undone. His star caught the silver light and threw it back like a broken promise. Thomas, Morrison said, his voice steady but tired. I didn't come here to fight you. Then why did you come? Morrison's eyes shifted toward the cabin window, where Sarah's pale face was pressed against the glass, her green eyes wide with fear and something that might have been hope. When Morrison looked at her, something broke inside his expression, something that had been holding itself together for too long. "She's my daughter," he said, and the words sounded like a confession pulled from his chest with pliers. "I know, you know." Morrison's surprise was genuine, his hand moving away from his gun entirely. "How?" "She told me. Tonight. About her mother, about you, about all of it." Morrison's shoulders sagged, as if someone had cut the strings that held him upright. "Elizabeth," he whispered, her name carrying across the distance between them like a prayer or a curse. "God, Thomas, I love that woman. Loved her more than my own love." Funny way of showing it. I was young. Stupid. Thought duty meant more than love. Thought a man had to choose between what he wanted and what was right. Morrison's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "Governor promised me the world if I came to the Capitol. Said I could make a real difference, clean up corruption, be somebody important." Thomas said nothing, letting the silence do the work of judgment. "I was going to send for her," Morrison continued, his voice breaking around the edges. "Soon as I got settled, soon as I had enough money saved up. But the work consumed me, and the months turned into years, and before I knew it, I was a different person living a different life. I told myself she was better off without me. Told myself she would find someone else, someone worthy of her. She never did. No." Morrison's voice was barely a whisper now. "She raised my daughter alone, worked herself to death trying to provide for her, and I never even knew Sarah existed until it was too late to matter." Through the window, Sarah watched them both with those eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Thomas could see her small hands pressed flat against the glass, could imagine the fear and confusion warring in her chest as she waited to learn her fate. "What do you want, Morrison?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "I want to make it right. I want to take her with me, give her a proper home, a proper name. She's my blood, Thomas. My responsibility." "Your responsibility?" Thomas felt something hot and dangerous rise in his throat. "Where was your responsibility when Elizabeth was dying? Where was it when Sarah got sold at auction like livestock? Where was it when she spent weeks sleeping by my door because she was too scared to trust that she was safe?" Morrison flinched as if Thomas had struck him. "I know I failed them. Both of them. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make the future better. For who? For Sarah, or for the guilt that's eating you alive?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, and Thomas saw the truth of it written across Morrison's face. This was not about love or responsibility or making things right. This was about a man who could not live with the weight of his own choices, who thought claiming his daughter now might somehow balance the scales of his conscience. "She doesn't want to go with you," Thomas said quietly. "How can you know that?" "No, she's just a child. She doesn't understand what's best for her. I know because I've been watching her for weeks now. Watching her jump at shadows, watching her sleep by the door ready to run, watching her learn to trust that maybe, just maybe, there's a place in this world where she can be safe." Thomas took a step closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "And I know because every time your name comes up, every time she even thinks about you, she starts shaking like a leaf in a storm." As if summoned by his words, the cabin door opened and Sarah stepped out onto the porch. She was small in her worn dress and bare feet, but there was something in the way she held herself that made her seem older than her 12 years. She walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, until she stood between the two men who had shaped her life in such different ways. "Sarah," Morrison said, and his voice was full of pain and longing and desperate hope. "Baby girl, I know you don't understand all of this, but I'm your father. Your real father. I want to take care of you now, give you everything you deserve." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, studying his face in the moonlight. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, the first full sentence Thomas had heard her say since the night she told him the truth. "You left my mama to die alone," she said, and each word fell like a stone into still water. You let them sell me like I was nothing. You're not my father. A father doesn't abandon his family and then come back when it's convenient. Morrison's face crumpled, years of guilt and regret finally breaking through the dam he had built around his heart. Sarah, please. I know I made mistakes, but you made choices, she said, her green eyes blazing with a strength that reminded Thomas of her mother's courage. And now I'm making mine. She turned to Thomas then, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tight with emotions he thought he had buried with his own daughter. Trust. Love. The kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing, beyond any doubt, where you belonged. I want to stay with Thomas, she said, her small hand slipping into his calloused one. He bought me when nobody else would. He taught me to milk cows and gather eggs, and how to read the sky for weather. He makes me feel safe. He makes me feel like I'm home. Thomas felt his throat close up, felt tears he had not shed in years burning behind his eyes. This child who had been broken and sold and abandoned had chosen him, had seen something in his lonely heart worth staying. Morrison stood silent for a long moment, the weight of his daughter's rejection settling over him like a shroud. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. You're right, he said, pulling the star from his shirt and looking at it like he was seeing it for the first time. Both of you. I'm not her father. I never earned that right. He looked at Thomas, and there was something like respect in his eyes. But you are. I can see it in the way she looks at you, the way she trusts you. You're the father I never was. He set the badge down on a fence post and walked to his horse, moving like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Before he mounted, he turned back one last time. Take care of her, he said. Love her the way I never could. Then he rode away into the darkness, and Thomas knew they would not see him again. Sarah squeezed Thomas's hand, and he squeezed back, both of them watching until Morrison's silhouette disappeared into the night. When the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, Sarah looked up at him with those green eyes that no longer held fear. Are you really going to keep me? She asked. If you'll have me, Thomas said. It won't be easy. I'm not good with words, and I don't know much about raising girls. But I promise you'll never have to sleep by the door again. You'll never have to wonder if you're safe. Sarah smiled then, the first real smile he had seen from her, bright as sunrise after the longest night. I like that, she said. I like that very much. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of light that made everything look new and possible. After breakfast, Thomas pulled out a small cloth bag he had been saving for the right moment. What's that? Sarah asked. Apple seeds, he said. Been carrying them around for years, waiting for the right place to plant them. Thought maybe today might be a good day to put them in the ground. They spent the morning digging holes in the earth behind the cabin, their hands working together in the dark soil. Sarah was careful with each seed, placing them gently in their earthen beds like she was tucking children into sleep. Will they grow? She asked, patting dirt over the last seed. Thomas looked at her dirt-smudged face, at the hope and trust shining in her eyes, and felt something bloom in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. They will, he said. It might take time, they'll need tending, but they'll grow into something beautiful. Something that will last long after we're gone. As they walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, Thomas thought about the seeds they had planted, about the time it would take for them to grow into trees that would bear fruit for generations to come, and he knew that some things were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth staying for. The morning stretched out before them, full of ordinary moments that felt like miracles, coffee to be made, cows to be milked, lessons to be learned about the simple art of being a family.